Hello and welcome back to our story, 250 Years of the United States of America. If you're new here, welcome aboard and make sure you check out our previous episodes to get the context for this year. This show runs through the notable events from our history in preparation for our 250th anniversary on July 4th of 2026, and our main focus for now remains on the revolution, though in general, the show will focus on the culture and politics of a nation always on the move. Each episode is designed to be a launching point for further research into these events, and I would love to be part of that conversation with you. The best place to get in touch is at 250 Years of USA on X or email 250yearsofusa@gmail.com. With introductions out of the way, let's get into the episode. "5 years into the Revolutionary War, the United States teeters on a razor's edge. Washington lays plans for the long-awaited victory while facing familiar personnel and supply issues, and darkness stains the frontier, though the American spirit shines on even there. Welcome to 1780 in America." It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and the 1780s begin in a nation at war. In Morristown, New Jersey, General George Washington commands roughly 10,000 troops, hunkering down in Jockey Hollow. Blizzards bury the camp in the snow, and supply wagons are delayed. The winter encampment at Morristown is not easy for Washington and the Continental Army. It is one of the coldest and most brutal winters recorded in the United States. Washington's 10,000 troops suffer many of the same problems that they did at Valley Forge: a lack of food, warm clothing, and basic essentials. Washington is hopeful that the French fleet will arrive in the warmer months and is desperate to bring the war to a quick close. Washington wants to take New York City with the use of the French Navy, but doesn't know when or where his allies will arrive. He writes to Congress, urgently begging them for food and supplies. A hungry army can't fight, and Washington knows every day without provision risks the collapse of his men. Meanwhile, civilians across the country are only barely getting by. Many Pennsylvania farmers slaughter their pigs early, their barns thinning out as war and winter empties their reserves. In New York, merchants jack up salt prices as continental dollars remain hyperinflated. The war's effects are not just seen on the battlefield, but in every empty pantry, every frozen home, and every empty bed. After capturing Vincennes in 1779, Clark maintains a fragile but meaningful hold on the Illinois country. His victories at Kaskaskia and Vincennes disrupted British control, and now in winter, Clark is hunkered down with his men. And though the movements are slowed and attacks are less frequent, he knows that he can never let his guard down. British agents in Detroit arm sympathetic Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware tribes to raid Patriot settlements, aiming to destabilize the frontier and draw Clark's forces thin. It's an asymmetric war. The natives are able to move covertly, and their tactics and timing are unpredictable. Clark, however, has the brute force and retains an advantage in open battle, though supply and manpower shortages limits his reach. 5 years ago, Daniel Boone and a group of about 30 men blazed a road from Virginia into the heart of the territory of Kentucky, known as the Wilderness Road. At the end of the road, Boone and his men established a fortified settlement that they called Boonesboro, where today Simon Kenton is wintering, recovering from his months of Shawnee captivity and torture. He corresponds with Clark, and they soon begin to plan their summer offensive against the Indians. It's now February when we get a grim first in American history. Death and crime are not unknown to Americans, with the war and poor living conditions contributing to a marked increase in both. Mass murder, however, is as of yet unheard of outside of the war and Indian raids. And that, unfortunately, changes on the 3rd when Barnett Davenport kills Caleb Mallory, his wife, their daughter-in-law, and their 2 young grandchildren in a rural Connecticut home. Davenport was born in 1760 and enlisted in the Continental Army as a teenager. He had served at Valley Forge and Fort Ticonderoga before he became a tenant in the Mallory household. Had it happened today, Davenport's crime might be ascribed to some form of post-traumatic stress from the brutal and up-close fighting that he's done as a teenager. But for now, it's viewed quite differently. His long-winded, shocking, and detailed confession is posted on our X should you be curious enough to read it, though it's too graphic to read here, and these writings from his twisted mind prompt much soul-searching in this young nation's press. Though it seems likely the confession was in whole or at least part written on his behalf by Reverend Judah Champion of Litchfield's Congregational Church, whom he gave the confession to. That's me going out on a little bit of a limb, but in his confession he says that after the age of 11 he ditched school and began a life of crime. His vocabulary and style of writing, however, speak to a man with much more training. And the inclusion of certain phrases, such as, "Oh, that others may take warning by my dreadful example and fearful end, and avoid those sins which I have committed," speak to a level of editorializing. Either way, many pamphlets are written about his crime, and the perception of murderers begins to change in parts of the American public's mind. Until now, crime has most often been seen as the result of a sinner losing their way, but Davenport's crime and the details surrounding it, specifically the violence committed against children and the gory public confession, caused people to perceive such criminals as evil and alien to the rest of society, beyond the hope of any salvation. Now, back to the South, where February storms have thrashed Clinton's fleet on the voyage from New York, but he is finally able to land on an island 30 miles south of Charleston. Patriot General Benjamin Lincoln commands 5,000 men, both militia and Continentals, and fortifies the city's neck between the Ashley and Cooper rivers. Lincoln's men build defenses and inspect their weapons as they prepare for the British onslaught, one that both sides know could turn the tides decidedly in the favor of the British. If they can seize control of Charleston, they can control the southern ports, and thus its trade, and can begin influencing the culture, ideally creating a loyalist stronghold in the South. Clinton is betting on such success. Across the sea, Benjamin Franklin is still at work in his diplomatic role. On February 20th in Paris, he presses Foreign Minister Vergennes for more aid in the form of troops, ships, and cash. He writes, "I am now put into a situation that distresses me exceedingly. We have had hopes of some aid from Spain, but they are vanished. The expectation of a loan in Holland has also failed. I submit these important circumstances to your Excellency's wise consideration. The States will be well able in a few years of peace to repay all that shall be advanced them in this time of difficulty." Back in the U.S., Iroquois warriors, especially from the Seneca and Mohawk nations, begin retaliatory raids against American settlements along the frontier. Sullivan's Scorched Earth campaign last year devastated many native villages and crops in New York, but the fighting spirit of the Iroquois is galvanized, not quashed. March brings rain, and the South is soaked. The British reach the Ashley River, camping on James Island 3 miles from Patriot lines, and Colonel John Lawrence urges a night raid to cripple them before they can attack. Lincoln refuses to leave his 1,400 sick and wounded behind, exposing them to capture or worse. He instead orders that the trenches be dug deeper and favors the odds of a defensive battle. Clinton's troops then slog through the swamps and cross the Ashley River by mid-March. Lincoln's Patriot fighting force is sniping from the earthworks in an attempt to slow their forward advance, but British engineers carve siege lines while under fire, and with more and more British and British allied fighters rallying to the southern front, Clinton's force soon swells to 13,000 men, far outnumbering the scrappy 5,000 Continentals, militiamen, and volunteers under Lincoln. The Continental Army is a patchwork. Some troops are backed solidly by wealthy and organized states, while others, especially those in the Independent Corps, are falling through the cracks. Independent units raised by the Continental Congress are composed of men that don't have a home state looking out for them. That means they often get nothing, while soldiers standing right next to them doing the same work in the same battle are warm, fed, and paid because their state was able to provide funding. Washington calls for a national uniform system for paying, supplying, and managing the army under congressional direction, and warns that continued neglect and disunity may very well lead to the disintegration of the army due to discontent and mutiny, despite the patriotism that has thus far held it mostly together, though resignation and abandonment has plagued Washington's force since the beginning. From his headquarters in the north, Washington continues to fight the political battle on behalf of his troops to address the problem that's been hindering the military's success, but on the 16th of March attempts to lift spirits in another way. He issues a general order that reads, "The General congratulates the army of the very interesting proceedings of the Parliament of Ireland and the inhabitants of that country, which have been lately communicated, not only as they appear calculated to remove those heavy and tyrannical oppressions on their trade, but to restore to a brave and generous people their ancient rights and freedom, and by their operations to promote the cause of America. Desirous of impressing upon the minds of the army transactions so important in their nature, the General directs that all fatigue and working parties cease for tomorrow, the 17th, a day held in particular regard by the people of the nation. At the same time that he orders this, he persuades himself that the celebration of the day will not be attended with the least rioting or disorder. The officers to be at their quarters in camp, and the troops of the state line to keep within their own encampment." Back in Passy, France, Franklin meets with John Adams, who has recently arrived to aid peace talks. Franklin is wearing a French-made prototype of his double-lens glasses as he discusses the most recent British overtures toward an end to the conflict should America cede independence. Franklin's dual-vision lenses, designed to aid both near and far vision in a single pair, emerge from his frustration with switching between two sets of spectacles, one for reading, another for distance. Franklin avoids patenting the invention, viewing it as a public good, and shares the design with Parisian spectacle makers who begin crafting bifocals for clients later this year. His glasses are pricey and remain a luxury, but Franklin later gifts several to colleagues, including John Adams, who praises their utility. Heading back to South Carolina, the British complete their first parallel trench and are now only 800 yards off Patriot positions, mounting 12 heavy guns that break through the ramparts Lincoln's men have built. They fire back, hitting their lines, but lose 15 gunners to cannonballs. Benjamin Lincoln and his officers, William Moultrie and Charles Pinckney, debate evacuation but hold off, hoping to keep the British from taking Charleston from its 7,000 civilians. Out west, Kenton accompanies Clark on a reconnaissance mission towards the Ohio River, probing Shawnee villages. For now, they avoid direct engagement, mapping routes and locations of crops and stores for a planned summer offensive, though, as we'll see, the fight finds them first. Back in Charleston on the 10th, Clinton demands surrender, offering parole if the Patriots yield. Lincoln rejects surrender and cannonballs begin smashing homes day and night. On the 14th, Lincoln tells Washington their fate is hanging by a thread. Arbuthnot's fleet soon cuts off supplies and prevents escape, turning Charleston into a cage. Civilians either flee or hide as their city becomes a war zone. In late April, in response to the intelligence received out west of increasing native and British military activity north of the Ohio River, especially signs of a possible large-scale invasion from Fort Detroit, George Rogers Clark musters 200 militia to Fort Jefferson to hold the line. His goal is partially to show force in order to deter an attack, to patrol vulnerable areas, and possibly move north of the river to confront raiders early. but the information he receives is somewhat vague. Clark doesn't yet realize how large Henry Byrd's force will be or exactly where it will strike. Clark sends 25 scouts north of the Ohio River, probing Shawnee camps. They clash with natives near modern-day Cincinnati, killing 3 warriors, and there, they discover a British musket laying beside one of the fallen, thus proving the fighters were employed as part of a British strategy. We head back to Charleston on May 11th, where British sappers breach Lincoln's outer walls and their guns kill 60 in a single day. Lincoln begins to propose terms for a surrender, seeking honorable parole, but Clinton insists on total capitulation and knows he's got the upper hand. On May 12th, after 42 days of siege, faced with dwindling food supplies, pressure from Charleston citizens, and failed attempts to negotiate a truce with the British, Lincoln is forced to surrender the city. It marks the worst Patriot defeat of the war. 5,000 men stack their arms in half-board prison ships where fever festers, hoping now more than ever that the war ends soon. Survival rates among the men held on these ships is abysmal. About half of the men held will die before they're released. Clinton writes London that the rebellion has been gutted. It's not just the men that are lost, it's the American morale, momentum, and their southern stronghold. One Patriot fighter notably absent from the surrender of Charleston is Captain Francis Marion. I've mentioned before that after this initial series completes, I want to go back and deep dive on specific figures or events that I find interesting from our 250-year history. Francis Marion is one of those men that definitely will get an episode. Marion has been in command of Fort Sullivan for 3 years, and last year he joined his men in the siege of Savannah, which they lost, before relocating to South Carolina. Marion broke his ankle, evading the drunken company of one of his officers at a dinner party in a bizarre incident, and left Charleston to recuperate in the country, with the fortunate result that he was not captured when the British took it. Upon learning of the fall of Charleston, he begins organizing an armed band of volunteers to contest British control of South Carolina's interior, mainly the area north of Charleston, between the city and the North Carolina border. The swampy forests provide ample hiding places and prove to be ideal for the guerrilla tactics that Marion employs. British Colonel Banastre Tarleton has been given the mission to destroy any remaining colonial resistance in the state and cement the British control of South Carolina. On the 29th, near the North Carolina border, a cavalry charge by Tarleton's men scatters the 350 Patriots forming a battle line, and they surrender. Tarleton and his men then proceed to shoot at the surrendering Patriots, a move that spawns the term Tarleton's Quarter for the rest of the Revolution. Although the Americans are routed, this loss becomes a propaganda victory for the Continentals, and wavering Carolina civilians are now terrified of Tarleton and their loyalist neighbors, spurring even more to rally around the Patriot cause. On June 5th, now confident of British control in the South, General Clinton sails back to New York, having learned of an impending French expedition to the British-occupied northern state, leaving General Charles Cornwallis in command of 8,300 British forces in the south. Francis Marion strikes from Carolina marshes, ambushing British supply lines. He tells his men that they're uncatchable, and his raids keep hopes alive in the south. The band he assembles usually numbers between 20 and 70 men, most of whom supply their own arms and horses, and keeping the group small aids them in remaining undetected. Up north in June, Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen is in command of New York City and the surrounding area in Clinton's absence. Getting word that Clinton is now on his return trip from a successful siege in Charleston, Knyphausen decides it's a good time to begin mobilizing against Washington at Morristown. With the Continentals outnumbered, General William Maxwell goes to the countryside to raise militia forces to bolster Patriot ranks, while Washington gives operational control to Major General Nathaniel Greene. In Massachusetts, following approval by town meetings, a new constitution is ratified on June 15th. The Constitution was drafted in part by John Adams and is set to go into effect in October. It contains 3 parts: a preamble, Part the First, a declaration of the rights of the inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Part the Second, the frame of government. What's notable here is the Declaration of Rights precedes the frame of government, reinforcing Adams' commitment to individual freedoms. The Declaration of Rights includes prohibitions against unreasonable searches and seizure, against ex post facto laws and the public taking of private property without just compensation, and reinforces freedom of the press, the right to petition the government, and a right to trial by jury. As the Constitution is still in effect in 2025, it is by some considered the oldest functioning constitution in the world. A major focus of the Constitution is also theocratic pursuits. Article 2 states it is the right as well as the duty of all men in society, publicly and at stated seasons, to worship the Supreme Being, the great Creator and Preserver of the universe. Article 3 goes even further, saying, as the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality, the people of this Commonwealth have a right to invest their legislature with power to authorize and require, and the legislature shall from time to time authorize and require, the several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God, and for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality, in all cases where such provision shall not be made voluntarily. Every denomination of Christians demeaning themselves peaceably and as good subjects of the Commonwealth shall be equally under the protection of the law, and no subordination of any one sect or denomination to another shall ever be established by law. This early Declaration of Rights also makes explicit the right of the people to keep and bear arms, saying in Article 17, "The people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, and as in time of peace armies are dangerous to liberty, they ought not be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it." It's all in all a fascinating read and is posted in full on our X at 250 Years of USA, so go ahead and check out the world's oldest functioning constitution today and keep the conversation going. On June 23rd, Hillary Clinton returns to New York, and he and Kniphausen decide upon an attempt at Hobart Gap and Morristown. The plan is two-pronged. Clinton hopes that Washington will bring out his army to push back against one British force, as another sails up the Hudson to march south, thus trapping the Continentals. The plan doesn't go well, however. Fighting begins in the morning, with British troops quickly pushing American forces back from their forward positions. As the British seize one of the key areas, they shift their focus to a nearby road and attempt to seize a critical river crossing. However, the bridge has already been destroyed by American forces, slowing their progress. As the British attempt to push forward again, they encounter stiff resistance from American forces conducting a fighting retreat and receiving reinforcements. Fearing that they're the ones being led into a trap, the British unit falls back to regroup with the main force. They manage to capture a key elevation but are still unable to break through the Patriots' lines. With American militia numbers growing and the path forward still blocked, the British commanders decide to abandon the attack. As they withdraw, they are harassed by militia fighters, and the British return to their starting position by midnight. These battles of Connecticut Farms and Springfield are small, but at the same time significant. They prove that New Jersey militiamen will stubbornly oppose any attempt by the British to move inland. The battles also show to Washington and Greene that militia and Continental regular troops can in fact work well together given the proper leadership. Now, back to the West, where Clark learns of Captain Byrd's gathering warriors for a major strike, targeting the Kentucky Territory or the Illinois country. The civilians in these Virginia counties prepare for an upcoming attack, petitioning Clark to source more firearms and powder. Virginia law requires every free male to own a working firearm, ammunition, and powder, and this law extends to the Kentucky Territory, making firearm ownership nearly universal, though should this incoming force be as powerful as the rumors suggest, it is feared that a single musket in the home may not be enough. Captain Henry Byrd amasses a combined force of 1,150 soldiers, consisting of 1,000 Indian troops and 150 white soldiers, some Detroit militiamen and some bombardiers from the Royal Regiment Army. They are initially gathered in order to attack Fort Jefferson. However, the Indian troops refuse to attack the fort due to its association with General Clark, who they fear for the stories that have been passed on to them from those present in earlier clashes. George Rogers Clark is known to them as the Chief of the Big Knives due to his many raids against Indian tribes, thereby instilling fear into the hearts of these fighters. The target of Byrd's forces now changes to Ruddle Station, a small log fort with around 20 families. Though the fort is caught off guard by the sudden arrival of an army of Indians and British troops, they are able to hold their own, and nothing is gained until Captain Henry Byrd arrives with his bombardier squadron and their cannons. Once the cannons are in place, the fortifications are quickly breached, and the men inside surrender. The Indian fighters under Byrd are deaf to the idea of a peaceful surrender and kill some of the individuals inside despite the surrender, taking others prisoner before plundering the encampment for arms and food stores. As the collective army moves towards Fort Martin, another small encampment that's only 5 miles away from Ruddle Station, Captain Byrd convinces the Indians to pass all the prisoners at this fort over to the British. As with Ruddle Station, the settlers at the fort are taken by surprise and quickly conquered. Captain Byrd now leads his men back to Fort Detroit as his troops are dangerously low on supplies, and there are rumors that General Clark is gathering his own troops to combat the invading force. We'll take a quick detour to Newport, Rhode Island for July 11th when French Admiral Rochambeau lands with his 5,500 troops. Washington meets with him 9 days later and is pleased to receive the much-needed lifeline. Now, back to the frontier, Clark is apprised of Byrd's invasion and organizes a retaliatory expedition at Ohio Falls, rallying 1,000 militia including Kenton by July 20th. About 50 disciplined and well-trained men, detached from the Corps of Virginia State Regulars, represent the most valuable component of the men under Clark's command. Accompanying them is a brass 6-pounder that they stole last year. With this cannon, Clark hopes to breach any wooden palisades erected to defend against his forces without resorting to time-consuming siege operations or a risky direct assault. On July 30th, he begins the march north, crossing the Ohio River and heading for Shawnee villages. Speed is of the utmost importance, as natives have Clark and his men under nearly constant surveillance. The Kentuckians understand that they have to arrive at Shawnee towns and engage in battle before the villages are abandoned, or, more ominously, the Shawnee with the British attempt to ambush Clark along his route. On August 5th, as Clark's men are 5 miles out from their first target, Chillicothe, his spies return from reconnaissance and recount that the community is in the process of abandonment. His soldiers immediately break into a run, reaching Chillicothe at noon and finding that much of the town has already been burnt by the fleeing Shawnee. The soldiers take advantage of the occasion by feasting on vegetables and food that is found still boiling over fires. Clark orders that everything still standing in the vacated town, as well as several hundred acres of green corn and other vegetables, be reduced to ashes. 12 miles away stand the Piqua settlements, where the Shawnee have determined to make a stand, though the slow movement of pulling a cannon and a bad thunderstorm ground Clark and his men for now. On August 8th, Clark divides his force of 1,000 troops to surround the Shawnee village of Piqua, and they move quickly from all sides. A Shawnee scouting party is making a report just as Clark's men enter the edge of the settlements. The Shawnee fighters hastily hide in the tall grass, and as the Kentuckians cross the river, they begin shooting. Clark orders a detachment to head up the river and secure a position behind the village, and Simon Kenton, who was imprisoned here just 2 years ago, leads the charge. Outflanked and outgunned, the tribesmen are compelled to withdraw to their strongholds. The brass 6-pounder is now brought up and is fired a dozen or so times at the stockade, each shot shattering the timbers wherever it is struck. As their bulwarks collapse, the Shawnee run from the fort and from nearby cabins, joining others who have lingered in the woods. This encounter is not the conclusive victory Clark has been hoping for, since most of the villagers evade capture. The Patriots sleep the night in the damaged structures, taking turns keeping watch and shooting at every sound they hear. The next day sees the implementation of Clark's scorched earth policy. The soldiers are impressed by the vast planted fields of maize, beans, squash, pumpkins, and Irish potatoes, which are so vital to this thriving community. The crops spread more than 5 miles, and a full day is taken to destroy them. 800 acres of corn, immense quantities of vegetables, and 4 villages are laid to waste. Some sources I've found mention that as the burning is taking place, a few elderly stragglers in the village are executed, though the reports there are spotty. Clark's men leave that night, heading back to Ohio Falls, hoping that the destruction of the fields at both Chillicothe and Piqua so late in the season caused the Shawnee to face a harsh winter, and thus be crippled by next year. South Carolina faces a few dark days. On August 16th, near Camden, South Carolina, Major General Horatio Gates engages British forces under Lieutenant General Cornwallis in one of the most devastating Patriot defeats of the Revolutionary War. Gates has assembled a force of approximately 3,700 troops, including 1,400 Continental Regulars and around 2,300 state militia, many of them untested and poorly equipped. Cornwallis commands a smaller but well-trained and disciplined force of about 2,200 British regulars and Loyalist troops. At dawn, the British launch a coordinated advance with bayonets fixed. The Americans face a rapid and brutal assault. Lacking bayonets and battlefield experience, the militia breaks ranks and flees within minutes, causing widespread confusion. The Continental Line holds briefly, but is eventually overwhelmed, and the result is catastrophic. Nearly 900 Americans are killed or wounded, and over 1,000 are taken prisoner, while British casualties total only 320. Gates flees the battlefield and retreats nearly 60 miles north to Hillsborough, North Carolina, effectively abandoning his army. The debacle at Camden shatters Gates' reputation and leaves the interior of South Carolina firmly under British control, severely jeopardizing Patriot supply lines. 2 days later, and 40 miles north of Camden, Colonel Bannister Tarleton's 270 dragoons strike Colonel Thomas Sumter's 800 Patriots along Fishing Creek in a swift assault. Tarleton's men kill 150 and capture 300, seizing 1,000 muskets and 40 wagons. Morale in the South is now at an all-time low, but it's not without some sparks keeping it alive. Francis Marion's 20-man militia raids British outposts near the PD River, destroying a supply barge and freeing 30 prisoners, proving grit and surprise attacks are still effective at repelling British dominance. We now arrive at the infamous story of Benedict Arnold, who, if you remember from yesterday's episode, was recently court-martialed and reprimanded by Washington, but allowed to continue to serve. Arnold played key roles at Ticonderoga and Saratoga amongst other battles, but despite his battlefield achievements, was repeatedly passed over for promotions, criticized by Congress, and saw junior officers promoted ahead of him. He became disillusioned with the American cause, especially after France entered the war, believing the war had gone from a fight for liberty to a power grab led by radicals in Congress. After his court-martial, Arnold was saddled with debt and a loss of reputation. His new wife, Peggy Shippen, came from a Loyalist family in Philadelphia and had connections to British officers, including Major John Andre, with whom he began corresponding. In his letters, he offers military intelligence and eventually the surrender of the fort at West Point, where he had been given command in exchange for £20,000 and a commission as a general in the British Army. In September, Arnold arranged to hand West Point over to the British by intentionally weakening its defenses. However, before the plan could be executed, Andre was caught behind American lines with incriminating documents hidden in his boot. That brings us to the 25th, where Arnold is set to meet with George Washington at West Point for a routine inspection on the morning he receives word that Andre is captured. At breakfast, surrounded by aides and guests, Arnold remains calm at hearing the news. After hastily excusing himself, Arnold mounts his horse, telling his officers that he needs to rush to receive Washington at the river landing. But instead of riding toward Washington, he gallops in the opposite direction to the shoreline where the British warship Vulture is anchored. Fully aware of the sentence for treason, Arnold boards a small barge and orders it to shove off. As the vessel cuts through the Hudson, the wind picks up. He orders the rowers at gunpoint to bring him to the Vulture, revealing only at the last moment that he is fleeing to the British. Back at West Point, Washington arrives and is bewildered to find Arnold missing. He tours the fort anyway, but is puzzled by its unusually weak defenses. Cannons are unmounted, fortifications are incomplete, and soon he receives the intercepted documents, and the truth begins to dawn. Washington is said to be deeply shaken and reportedly mutters, "Arnold has betrayed us. Whom can we trust now?" A military court sentences Andre on September 27th, and he hangs later in the week. For Arnold, justice is never served, and he will later return and fight for the British in America. Let's head back to South Carolina, where on the night of September 28th, Francis Marion leads 50 militiamen on horseback against 60 Loyalists under Colonel John Ball at Black Mingo Creek, 30 miles south of Georgetown. At midnight, Patriots kill 3 Loyalists and capture 13, scattering the rest across the swamp. Marion's men make their retreat by dawn, avoiding British pursuit, and the raid secures a key crossing, hampering Loyalist movements and lifting spirits in the Lowcountry. Marion isn't the only one making waves in South Carolina. Let's talk a little bit about the Overmountain Men. The Overmountain Men are a group of frontiersmen living west of the Appalachian Mountains. They live in remote, rugged areas beyond the Proclamation Line and well into Indian Territory. Most live in log cabins built from timber they cut themselves, in small and isolated settlements consisting of scattered homesteads. They often have families but operate largely independently from any form of trade, growing crops and tending to livestock with only their brothers, wives, sons, and daughters for assistance. While it's rare members of such a rural community would ever meet in a church, traveling preachers occasionally venture into the community and hold meetings in cabins or in forest clearings. The children do not attend school, but families often ensure they have Bibles and primers in the home to teach their children reading skills. Hunting is essential for this lifestyle, and these Overmountain men are intimately acquainted with their Kentucky rifles, though the guns aren't called that yet. Life is punctuated by frequent conflicts with Indian tribes, particularly the Cherokee, who resist this encroachment on these lands. As we're about to see, these Overmountain men don't take kindly to the British either, and are about to help turn the tides in South Carolina. On October 7th, at Kings Mountain on the border between North and South Carolina, a force of approximately 900 Overmountain men engage and decisively defeat a larger British Loyalist force of about 1,100 men under the command of Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson is known for his arrogance and aggressive tactics. He has issued an ultimatum to the backcountry patriot days earlier, threatening to lay waste to their lands if they do not submit to British authority. The Overmountain men, hardened by years of frontier conflict and emboldened by tales of recent British atrocities, respond not as a formal army, but as a determined group of avengers. Many have lost friends and family to the war's violence and see this confrontation as a chance to exact justice. Taking advantage of the terrain, the Patriots surround Kings Mountain, a wooded ridge where Ferguson had fortified his position. Unlike the British-trained Loyalists, the Overmountain men are expert marksmen with their long rifles and are accustomed to fighting in the forest. They approach in small bands from multiple directions, using the trees for cover and laying down heavy strings of fire as they advance uphill. The battle lasts for just over an hour, and despite initial resistance, the Loyalist line collapses completely under relentless rifle fire. Major Ferguson is killed, reportedly shot multiple times, while attempting to rally his men and escape on horseback. In total, roughly 300 Loyalists are killed and over 700 are captured, while the Patriots suffer approximately 90 casualties. The victory is swift, complete, and profoundly symbolic. James Collins, a young South Carolinian who fought in the battle, later described it as retribution for previous defeats, particularly the disastrous Patriot loss at Camden. The impact of this battle at Kings Mountain ripples far beyond the battlefield. General Cornwallis is forced to suspend his planned advance into North Carolina and retreats back into South Carolina. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, the Continental Congress continues to struggle with its own crisis. On October 10th, delegates issue a desperate plea for $6 million to sustain the war effort. However, as we've mentioned, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress has no power to levy taxes or enforce funding from the states. Without Maryland's ratification, the Articles remain incomplete, and national unity remains fragile. Frustrated by inaction, Richard Henry Lee derides the Congress as a body of beggars reliant on the voluntary goodwill of the states. Many state governments fear that empowering Congress will replicate the centralized tyranny that they are still fighting to escape. Up north, on October 15th, near Fort George, New York, Washington's cousin, Colonel William Washington, pulls a fast one on the British. Disguised as a loyalist, his 200 dragoons lure 150 into an ambush. After a brief exchange of gunfire, the Redcoats surrender. The outnumbered Patriots need every edge they can get, and for now, cunning beats cannons. In November, Francis Marion earns the nickname he's remembered by today. Since the fall of Charleston, Marion has been taking his revenge with a small cadre of militiamen employing guerrilla tactics to frustrate the British plans for the region at every turn and free imprisoned patriots. Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton, informed of Marion's whereabouts by an escaped prisoner, chases the American militia for 7 hours, covering some 26 miles. Marion escapes by running into a swamp, and Tarleton gives up. As the story goes, cursing and saying, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." The story gets around, and soon the locals, who have despised the British occupation, are cheering for the swamp fox, Francis Marion. It's now December, and after the disastrous American defeat at Camden in August, Congress replaces General Gates with General Nathanael Greene. Greene's appointment marks a turning point in the Southern campaign, and he introduces a new strategy, splitting his army and waging a war of mobility and attrition. Within weeks of taking command, Greene divides his already outnumbered force, sending Daniel Morgan west to threaten British supply lines, and we'll hear how this goes next episode. On December 31st, George Washington is in New Windsor, having moved here in late November after spending the summer and early fall at West Point. In New Windsor, Washington establishes a new winter headquarters and camp for the Continental Army. Washington is mainly focused on maintaining the Army's readiness, managing supply shortages, and coordinating with French allies. This winter is less severe than the previous one at Morristown, but the challenges remain in sustaining troop morale and securing necessary provisions. With winter closing in yet again, soldiers are going unpaid, are underfed, and are not properly clothed. Elsewhere, this frustration of the Continentals leading to so much tension reaches a breaking point, but for today, this is where our story ends. So that's it for 1780, a year that nearly broke us. Charleston's the worst blow that the Americans have received, and the opposition is fierce. Tarleton is gaining infamy as an unscrupulous butcher, and Arnold has been shown to be a two-faced snake, but the red-blooded Americans won at Kings Mountain, and Marion is causing chaos from the shadows, while Nathaniel Greene's star is rising. This is our story, one of a nation that won't quit. Next, in 1781, there's a mutiny in the North. Freedom and independence are finally within reach, and Greene and Cornwallis face off. Thank you for joining me in 1780. Be sure to check our X for photos, maps, documents from the year, and get in contact. Tell me what you are enjoying about this show, what we missed. This has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America. And as always, thanks for listening.